Great, thank you. Everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started with our second panel of the day. But first, I want to take a second to thank Dan for moderating such an incredible panel. To hear Lee, Christy, for your insights. I don't know about others, but I know this is an issue that touches everybody, our parents, ourselves, sometimes our kids, and I think it really hit home for folks. So I really appreciate the thoughtful nature of the panel. Now I'm going to move us to our panel on drug prescribing and utilization. And it will be moderated by my colleague, Kristen Joyce, who's a senior health policy consultant at the Institute for Health Policy. Kristen leads our drug pricing initiative, providing strategic direction and content expertise to advance evidence-based, fair pricing policies. In this role, she facilitates leadership discussions, cultivates external partnerships, and advances policy in alignment with our organization's strategy. In addition to a fair drug pricing, Kristen works on coverage, affordability, and delivery system reforms. Prior to joining the Institute, she held health policy roles at the state of Colorado and in the U.S. Senate. So, Kristen, I'll hand it over to you. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. I'm really looking forward to moderating this panel and as a policy wonk following an actual professional moderator, so bear with me. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Adrienne Fu-Berman, who's a professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Physiology in the Department of Family Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. Dr. Fu-Berman co-directs the master's program in health in the public interest and directs Farmed Out, a research and education project at Georgetown University Medical Center. Farmed Out promotes rational prescribing, exposes unethical marketing practices, and has had a profound impact on prescribers' perceptions of the adverse consequences of industry marketing. Dr. Fu-Berman has authored many key articles in peer-reviewed literature on industry influence on medicine. And next we have Dr. Kim Lay. Kim Lay is my colleague at Kaiser Permanente. She is the interim senior vice president and interim chief pharmacy officer for National Pharmacy Services here at KP. Dr. Lay provides executive business leadership, direction, strategic planning, and oversight for all national clinical pharmacy services and programs, quality, national drug use management initiatives, and outcomes research, national pharmacy medication quality, and drug intelligence strategy. Before stepping into this interim role, Dr. Lay was vice president of clinical pharmacy services here at Kaiser Permanente, and she received her Doctor of Pharmacy and Bachelor of Science from Washington State University. We were also supposed to be joined by Dr. Carly Rodriguez from Moda Health, who is actually the president of the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, but due to weather travel restrictions, she's no longer able to be here. So luckily, we plugged in this nice break, got rid of one chair, and we are now doing a fireside chat instead of a panel. So before we get to the fireside chat, I'm really excited to hear from both of you today, Kim and Adrienne. But we're first going to hear from Dr. Jerry Avorn, who was also unable to be with us in person, but was able to provide some recorded remarks, and I think it's going to be helpful in grounding our conversation today. Dr. Avorn is a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and the chief emeritus at the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics, which luckily goes by the acronym DOPE, and co-director of the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, or PORTAL, and is a close colleague of Aaron Kesselheim, who Tony mentioned earlier, and close friends of KP. He's a general internist, geriatrician, and drug epidemiologist, and he pioneered the use of healthcare claims data to study patterns of medication use and outcomes. He also developed the concept of academic detailing, which we're going to talk a lot about today. He also participated in founding Alosa Health, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing doctors with non-commercial education about medicines. Finally, he is the co-author or author of over 600 papers, and he just published a book, Rethinking Medications. And if you're interested, it's a really great book, and he actually manages to make drug pricing policy humorous. And you can find a link to it on our forum webpage. Okay, so let's go ahead and cue the video, and then we'll have a discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking with you today about how prescribers make decisions about medications and how we can do it better. And also how patients make decisions about medications, because they are important players in this situation as well. I think of it as the last mile problem of we've got all this fantastic basic biomedical research and wonderful drugs developed either in medical centers or at drug companies, and then manufactured to very high standards, usually. And then they're there, and we need to figure out how can we make the best possible use of these wonderful products. And sadly, we often don't, whether the problem is among us prescribers or our patients not taking what we prescribe or not being able to afford what we prescribe. And on all fronts, I think we can do way better in getting these fantastic treatments to patients in ways that are both evidence-based and also affordable. And I've spent about 40 years thinking about this at Harvard Medical School. And as you know, I've pulled all those thoughts together in this book that just came out, Rethinking Medications. And so this is an opportunity for me to give you an under 10-minute synopsis of those 40 years and 500 pages. It began when I was a medical student, and I was struck by the huge difference between the science that we were learning in the classroom and the actual prescribing that I noticed was going on in the normal world. And at the moment, we are spending in 2025 over $35 billion on communicating about medications. Now, virtually all of that is by the pharmaceutical industry. About 5 billion of that or more goes to direct-to-consumer ads. The rest goes to us prescribers. And if you were to add in the free samples, it adds another several billion dollars to that amount. So the nation, the United States, is spending an enormous sum of money to communicate information about medications to doctors and to patients. But I've often wondered, why couldn't we use a tiny sliver of that enormous national expenditure? Because after all those dollars that are spent by the companies to advertise their wares end up being plowed into the prices of drugs, or are considered business expenses, which are deductible. So in a sense, it is all of us, patients, doctors, regular citizens, who are paying for that $35 billion a year, one way or another. And one of my fantasies, besides world peace and a sane government, is that we could have just a fraction of that go to some public interest communication about medications that would have no particular commercial agenda. So I figured we needed to test this in randomized controlled trials, the idea of having evidence-based folks working in medical schools deliver information to doctors about optimal prescribing with only an evidence base for the content and not a commercial agenda. And I named it academic detailing, as most of you know. We published a couple of randomized controlled trials of this in the New England Journal of Medicine, showing that it actually worked. And now there are programs all around the world that are doing this. The idea being it's kind of a public good, like clean air, clean water, other things that we may be running out of, that the government provides or that some public sector entity provides, because it's something we all need, but everybody shouldn't have to buy and build their own. So once we got all that prescribing information that I used for those randomized trials, I then married that with some clinical outcomes data from Medicare and Medicaid. And that led to a new take on doing pharmacoepidemiology. And I was able to found a division at Harvard and at the Brigham and Women's Hospital called the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics, but that's a whole other story. It also gave rise to two other things which are relevant to today. One of them is Portal, the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, run by my colleague, Aaron Kesselheim. And that has given us the opportunity to look at the interface within our division of pharmacoepi, or DOPE as we call it, to look at how regulation, prices, and evidence interact in making drugs available or less available to patients. The idea is we ought to be able to marshal all the paid claims data that we have about who is prescribing what, who is filling what prescriptions, who is not filling them, and then even marry that to clinical outcomes if we wanted to edge more into the pharmacoepi space. But at the very least, in the context of today's meeting, we can use that to direct programs of educational outreach or academic detailing. And maybe there's a doctor who could use some education about maybe you shouldn't be giving opioids to everybody that comes in with a sprained ankle. Those are the kind, or maybe you shouldn't use quite so many antibiotics for upper respiratory infections. That's the kind of information that is sitting there in the terabytes or petabytes that all of us have in our resources, whether we are insurers or state agencies or payors of another kind. And we need to harness that information better so that we can see where's the good prescribing happening and encourage that, and where's the problematic prescribing. And I should also add the under-prescribing. You know, we are still doing a terrible job of managing osteoporosis and hypertension and atrial fibrillation by not using enough medication. And there's a role for interventional pharmacology in that regard as well. It's not just telling people to stop doing stuff. It's a matter of encouraging people and educating people to do more of using of these great medications we have that can prevent disease and treat it so effectively. And so there's a lot that we can do to kind of combine the medication use data and the intervention and outreach. I've been a long-term fan of how Kaiser does this, frankly. I've observed with respect the process of reviewing the evidence, the system choosing the best medication on the basis of the evidence, and then doing its own educational outreach to communicate with the prescriber and with the patient. And it's based on the idea that we're all on the same side, or at least at Kaiser you are. That is, it's not the physician trying to maximize the benefit that he or she gets from a particular company's drug, or a payer trying to figure out how to maximize their rebates, although I know that goes on everywhere, sadly. But it's all a matter of saying, look, let's all work together to get the patient the meds they need and not go broke in the process. And I think Kaiser does that better than most any other system I know, except perhaps for the VA, which also does a magnificent job of developing an evidence-based formulary, getting drugs at a very good price, and then also running what I think is the largest, or has been, God knows what's happening in the future, but has been the largest academic detailing service in the country that the VA plants all over its programs in each state of the U.S. So to try to get to wrap up, where might all this go if things went well? Well, ideally, I would love to see what many European countries do, which is a systematic, publicly funded health technology assessment or HTA approach, much like our wonderful colleagues at ICER do in Boston, but comparing choices within a given common clinical problem and say, look, this is the best way to treat patients and it's also affordable. You ought to do that. Nobody's really out there, at least outside of the Kaiser and the VA systems, systematically telling that to doctors and also communicating in parallel with patients. We're spending about $500 billion a year on medications. And as I said, those $35+ billion on communication. We ought to be able to spend that more effectively. President Trump actually did us a favor by pointing, one of the few perhaps that he's done, pointing out that Americans are actually spending twice what Europeans spend on their drugs. What he failed to understand, I think, is that that's because there is this kind of systematic assessment of medications that many of the European countries conduct. So our goal, to wrap up, is to use the data, particularly pharmacoepidemiology, to define patterns of prescribing in a large population, perhaps one's own group of insured patients. Target educational outreach. Don't just say you can't do that or it's not on the formulary or have the patient find out when they go to the drugstore, but educate the doctor and the patient about why this is the best choice. And then one can even evaluate outcomes with that very same data to see, did this work for us like we thought? There's a lot of wonderful meds out there. To wrap up, it would be great if we could use them more effectively and not go broke in the process. The stakes are exponentially higher now that so many programs are under dire economic threat, really just raising the ante for getting this right. But I do think that by working together, we can do a better job to make sure that ideally every prescription that every prescriber writes for every patient is the most appropriate in terms of the evidence and the affordability. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, Jerry is a great time, and I'm sad that he's not with us in person. But we have two fantastic panelists, and we're going to go ahead and get started. As Dr. Aborn outlines, he outlines a lot of the factors that play into how prescribers make decisions about medications, which he kind of calls the last mile problem. I think of the first panel as the first mile problem. What are the root causes that we're talking about? And then this last mile problem is how are we making decisions about medications? What are the medications that patients are taking that prescribers are prescribing? As he outlines, he says the pharmaceutical industry spends billions of dollars marketing to both providers and patients, sometimes with the goal of steering prescribers towards higher priced drugs that might not be the best value for the patient. So I want to start with you, Adrian. He talks about the pharmaceutical industry marketing to both providers through a process called detailing, and then also to patients, which most notably would be direct-to-consumer advertising. And as many of us have seen, HHS Secretary RFK Jr. is really hoping to crack down on direct-to-consumer ads, and I'm curious to hear from you if that's the step in the right direction or if he's missing the mark about what sorts of pharmaceutical efforts are actually the most impactful. And I know you have a couple slides, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to say that my disclosure is that I'm a paid expert witness at the request of plaintiffs in litigation regarding pharmaceutical and medical device marketing practices. And certainly we all see these ads, so we know about direct-to-consumer advertising, but there's so many other pharmaceutical marketing tactics out there, and that's really what I want to address today. You know, Jerry said there are a lot of great drugs out there, and there are, but most of the great drugs aren't actually new drugs. And what we have today is really an epidemic of irrational prescribing. We're here today talking about drug costs, but anytime a drug is unnecessary, that's an unnecessary expense. An unnecessary drug is an unnecessary expense. And pharmaceutical promotion focuses on the newest, most expensive drugs, and those tend to be the drugs that physicians and other prescribers know about. Very few new drugs are innovative, and whenever I'm speaking to an audience where there are pharma people they immediately start they start saying, well, what about Gleevec? Okay, Gleevec, a great drug. What about COVID vaccine? Yeah, great drug. But the reason that they're mentioning Gleevec and COVID vaccine is because those ART mRNA vaccines actually are a really innovative therapeutic. Gleevec was really innovative, but a lot of the drugs that have come out in recent decades are not the least bit innovative. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how drug companies control information about even what we consider to be a disease, and how many risk factors and personality traits have become diseases lately. And unfortunately, prescribing practices follow promotion much more than they actually do science. So Tahir mentioned a number of ways in which drug companies can extend patents or add patents, creating a patent thicket on drugs. And there's many ways that drugs can be tweaked or combined in order to get the moniker of being a new drug, even if it isn't actually a new drug. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about those. Fixed dose preparations are drugs that combine two or more drugs. This is one of my favorite examples. So if you combine two prescription drugs, you can get a new patent. A prescription drug and a non-prescription drug, you can get a new patent. Two non-prescription drugs, you can get a new patent. A prescription drug and a vitamin, you can get a new patent. So there's lots of ways to get a new patent. And in this case, this was taking two over-the-counter medications, naproxen, an excellent over-the-counter analgesic, Nexium or esomeprazole, a completely unnecessary drug for reasons I'll get into. But anyway, if you were to combine these, esomeprazole, Nexium has some stomach protectant effects, so it's not a bad idea to take it with an analgesic that has some bad effects on the stomach. And if you were to combine them, it'd be $67 a month. A company came out with a prescription medication combining these two over-the-counter products, and when it was released as a prescription drug, it was more than $2,500 a month. I mean, any doctor or any prescriber who prescribed this, there should be sanctioned in some way. But many physicians only know brand names. They don't even know the generic names of drugs, and they may not even realize that the drug that they're prescribing is an old generic or a combination of over-the-counter drugs. So another tactic that's commonly used by drug companies is chiral switching. So a lot of drugs are racemic mixtures. They're a mixture of left-handed and right-handed molecules, and often half of those molecules are not active. So that's a racemate or a racemic mixture. So what a company might do is to release the racemic mixture and then release the left-handed molecules or the right-handed molecules, whichever one is active, as a new drug. And that's in an enantiomer. Sorry to take you back to chemistry. But and so S, Latin sinistra, is left-handed. Levo is actually, Levo is also left-handed. And then R is right-handed. So ketamine is an old, cheap, generic drug, but a company created Spravato, which is S-ketamine. So it's just the left-handed half of ketamine, which is a racemic mixture. The reason that I said that Nexium was a completely unnecessary drug is that it's the S-enantiomer of omeprazole. So omeprazole was Prilosec, which is an excellent drug. Nexium is merely half of it. It's just the enantiomers of the racemic mixture, and it's not the least bit more effective. In fact, when Nexium was approved by the FDA, they showed the FDA a study comparing 40 milligrams of Nexium with 20 milligrams of Prilosec, and oddly enough, the 40 milligrams was more effective than the 20 milligrams. There has never been a head-to-head study of the racemic mixture with the enantiomer. So it's often true that there's no actual advantage of isolating the active molecules from a racemic mixture. There have been a number of studies, and most of the time there's never been a comparison. When there is a comparison, most of the time the enantiomer is not more effective. Some drugs have to be broken down by the body in order to be effective. So a company can release the prodrug first and then the metabolite, or the other way around. They can release the metabolite and then the drug that breaks down into the metabolite. In some cases, for example, lisdexamfetamine. Dexamfetamine is an old, cheap, generic drug, often used to treat ADHD. The half-life of dextroamphetamine is 9 hours, which makes it actually perfect for giving to somebody who has to get through their workday or their school day. And so a company added lysine, it's just an amino acid, to the dextroamphetamine. That gets cleaved off in the body. The only thing it does is it creates, you get a peak effect earlier, which is probably a bad thing, but at least it's more expensive. So I think Tahir also mentioned that if you get a new indication, you can get a new name for the drug. And because doctors only know about brand names, they may not even realize that that two drugs have identical ingredients. So Prozac was a blockbuster antidepressant. Fluoxetine, that was made into Serafem, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. Wellbutrin's an antidepressant, was re-released as Zyban, which is used for smoking cessation. And Viagra, of course, we all know Viagra, was re-released as Revatio because it's also an effective drug for primary pulmonary hypertension. And I know of at least one case in which a doctor prescribed Prozac and Serafem together, not realizing that he was just doubling the dose of exactly the same drug. And by the way, even if someone's in a state where the pharmacist can substitute a generic drug, if there at some point there was a generic available for Prozac, but not for Serafem, even though they're exactly the same drug, if that makes sense. So if you have a new indication, you can get a patent extension on that drug. Okay, so how are drugs promoted? We've heard from Jerry some about drug rep visits and detailing, and the alternative to that, which is academic detailing. I'm going to talk just a little bit about gifts and samples. I'm not going to talk about these other things, but I'm happy to talk about any of them in the Q&A if people are interested, because organizations, professional organizations, patient advocacy groups are very much used as third parties to parrot marketing messages from pharmaceutical companies, and medical publications are used as well. Continuing medical education is also very important. Drug reps are quite key in selling drugs, and they still are, although giving out little pens and other kinds of small gifts really decreased a lot on a voluntary basis in about 2007. I feel like it's starting to come back a little bit, but there is still a lot of buying prescribers meals, giving them textbooks and patient models and other things like that. And any kind of gift affects prescribing. This is a study that my team did with Dr. Susan Wood at George Washington University Milken School of Public Health. And we looked at information from open payments and then also information from Medicare Part D prescribing. And when we looked at prescribers in DC, and we found that taking any gift from a drug company, and we're talking pizza, a sandwich, any gift from a drug company, resulted in not only that prescriber prescribing more expensive drugs and more branded drugs, but more drugs. The doctors who took even one gift from a drug company, even in the form of a meal, prescribed 2.3 more prescriptions per patient than the doctors who didn't take gifts. And that, we know there's a lot of unnecessary drugs in those prescriptions, right? Polypharmacy is such a problem in elders. And so that I thought was actually the most striking part of our study. It's not just costing the system more money. This is actually causing harm. A lot of doctors tell us, I only see drug reps for the samples. Samples are maybe one of the most effective marketing tactics that drug companies have. When a doctor gives a patient a sample, it's an endorsement. The patient is thinking, this is my doctor, they know me, they know my history, they've done a physical, they've thought about the different drugs that are available to them, and they've chosen this specific drug. You know, they're not thinking that, oh, the doctor just really likes the drug rep who comes in and thinks she's pretty, so puts her samples at the front of the sample cabinet. Once a patient is on a drug and they're doing all right, the patient doesn't want to change, the physician doesn't want to change. You might notice that samples are only for chronically used drugs. You're never getting a sample for the 5-day course of antibiotics. The real purpose of samples is to gain access to the physician. A physician has to sign for the samples. If a drug rep even spends 30 seconds talking to a prescriber about a drug, it increases prescriptions for those drugs. The doctor is actually making a commitment by writing a prescription for the same drug that he or she gave the sample for. Doctors like to give, I mean, everyone loves free stuff, right? I'm very thrilled about the Kaiser Permanente notebooks on the desk. We're not trying to change human nature here. However, you know, I try to convince prescribers that you need to just give your patients good medical care. You don't actually have to give them presents. If you want to give them presents, get some pens with your name on them and distribute those. They're not very expensive. And a lot of samples go home with physicians and their staff as well. And samples change prescribing behavior. If you ask physicians, they say that they give samples more to poor patients or uninsured patients. But when you actually do the survey of patients, it turns out that middle class and insured patients are much more likely to get samples than poor patients. And Farmed Out is starting an anti-samples campaign. We have an article on this, and we'll be doing some other things in the coming year.
One piece on that, Adrian, just to press on that a bit, is if they are trying to target poorer patients, can you talk a little bit about how the drop-off occurs when if their insurance doesn't cover that particular drug? It might end up being more expensive for that patient.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Kristen, that people are more likely to stay on generic drugs because they're likely to, because they can afford them. And if they start on a branded drug and then can't afford it, they will stop taking it. Yeah, that's a really, really great point. There's been some work done by Ornstein and Grokowski, also Joel Lection and Don Light, that there's actually an inverse relationship between how good a drug is and how aggressively it's promoted, which makes sense. If you have the drug that's the cure for pancreatic cancer, you're not going to have to promote that drug. But if you've got the drug that isn't very good or is the 7th drug in the category that has no advantages over the other 6, you're really going to have to promote that drug very aggressively. And drug companies don't provide objective information about drugs, especially about harms. And so prescribers know about the benefits of drugs, and they don't know about the harms. And not only do pharmaceutical companies not provide accurate information about drugs, they don't provide accurate information about diseases. And it may surprise you, maybe not, that drug companies are a huge source of information about diseases, especially when they just invent them, which they do. So they over-promote drugs for many conditions, and some diseases have just been invented out of whole cloth. Sometimes you take one symptom or a collection of symptoms, make that into a disease, or just take a personality trait and make that into a disease. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the diagnoses for psychiatry, has gotten thicker and thicker every year. Psychiatry is a great place for inventing diseases because when you think about it, every psychiatric diagnosis is subjective, right? We have no blood tests for depression or schizophrenia. We don't have any imaging tests for obsessive compulsive disorder. It's all subjective. And so it's very easy to invent psychiatric diseases. It's illegal to market a drug before it comes on the market, but it's not illegal to market a disease you made up. Marketing for a drug actually starts 7 to 10 years before the drug comes on the market. So a drug company can talk about the tragedy of the lack of drugs for the disease they made up. They can talk about mechanisms of actions. They can trash other cheap generic therapies that are out there before their drug comes on the market. And so I'm not going to talk about these unless you want to in the Q&A, but this is a very partial list of conditions that were created by pharmaceutical companies in order to sell a specific drug. And the marketing message for invented diseases often focus on how a particular condition is underdiagnosed. We call it the tragic epidemic. It's like, this condition is underdiagnosed. People don't know about it. It's wrecking lives. It's wrecking marriages. It's really hurting people. And it may also focus on how current treatments for something are problematic or they're lacking. So I said I would talk about Serafem. It's one of my favorite drugs. This is fluoxetine, so it's just Prozac. It was fluoxetine, 20 milligrams. So it was the same drug in the same dosage, but they did change the color of the pill when they released it as Serafem. And I love drug names. I think more recently, they haven't been coming up with really good names, but they used to hire companies to come up with drug names. And Serafem is one of my favorites. So Sarah, of course, is a woman's name. Fem is feminine. Oh, so this is a drug for premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is a made-up condition. It's like PMS on steroids, okay? So premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Okay, so Sarah is a woman's name. Fem, of course, is feminine. And Serafim, spelled a different way, what does that mean? S-E-R-A-P-H-I-M? Angels. Drug makes you into an angel. Who wouldn't want that? And just another example, Paxil. So Paxil is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It was kind of late to market. So it was maybe the 6th or 7th serotonin reuptake inhibitor on the market. So there probably wouldn't have been much market share for depression. So they created a new disorder, social anxiety disorder, which is a condition that we used to call shyness. And there's been a book and articles written about how this was created in order to advantage this drug. So just in conclusion, drugs can save lives. They can improve health. There are many drugs that are underused. That is certainly true. But promotion interferes with both knowledge about drugs that healthcare providers have and the appropriate use of drugs. And if you'd like more information, please visit our website.
Thank you so much. So thinking back to how RFK Jr. is talking about cracking down on direct-to-consumer advertising, I can definitely see that being useful as you're talking about, promotion of particular diseases. But you outline a lot of different ways that pharma markets, and so perhaps that's not the silver bullet that some folks think it might be.
Yeah, definitely not, because it's still the prescriber who has the prescription pad, right? And I read an industry publication some time ago that described the prescriber as being, described doctors as being in the way between drug companies and their customers. Wow. So really, drug companies would rather just sell their drugs directly to consumers, but no, they have to get through the prescriber. They have to have somebody write a prescription for their drug. So most of the marketing is really directed towards prescribers, and most of that marketing is covert. It's through continuing medical education. It's through sponsorship at meetings and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And you have a whole part of your website on pharma-free CME, right? So we can,
yes.
go visit that if you'd like.
It does exist.
And I have a question a little bit about direct-to-consumer prescribing, so we'll get to that in a minute. But I want to bring in you, Kim. So Adrian talks a lot about the how doctors often know about the benefits of a drug, but don't always know about the harms. And then Jerry talks about academic detailing and how there are different ways to educate prescribers. And I'm wondering if you can dive into how this works at KP. What is our process at KP for educating providers and for determining what drugs we prescribe in the first place?
Yeah, excellent question, Kristen. At Kaiser, we've, as an evidence-based organization or value-based organization, we've invested in professionals and scientists who, who are looking for the clinical evidence when it comes to whether it's the most appropriate lab to prescribe for a disease or, particular drugs. And so for today, we'll just talk about the evidence-based team, a pharmacist that review drugs in collaboration with our physician partners, and how we bring those drugs to our formulary or how we bring those drugs within our organization. Very similar to what Jerry outlined. It was actually really funny. So I was telling one of my pharmacists, I said, hey, I'm going to speak this forum and I'm hoping I'm going to represent our evidence-based, process really well. And here's this great, video from Jerry. And she said, Kim, I learned from Jerry. Our academic detailing, our ways of looking at evidence within Kaiser Permanente was actually taught to us by Jerry. And so we've taken those fundamentals and, we are looking at drugs when they come to market probably 6 to 8 months before the FDA approval. So our evidence-based team is looking at articles, at the trials that were submitted for approvals. They're looking at the competitor information. We're looking at safety data, whether that's going to ISMP, if there's, any safety information there. We're going to ICER. We're going to any pharmacoeconomics review. And together with our physicians, we create these beautiful monographs, very detailed monographs that we initially provide with our specialists to review and said, hey, we've tried to take out all of the noise that might be built in some of these clinical trials. And we want to present unbiased, objective data. And so we work with our physicians ahead of the FDA approval. We build that monograph. We get their endorsement for do they believe should be on formulary? Should it not be on formulary? Should it be on non-formulary with some exception? And we get their endorsement. And so by the time we bring it to P&T, we've already educated our specialists on the value of this product. Mm-hmm. Right? And so then we bring it to P&T, we've got, endorsement, we've got a vote, and then, we place it on our formulary as appropriate, based on the evidence, based on the value, and based on the safety of that medication.
So you're saying that the providers and the pharmacists are working together throughout this process in order to develop the formulary. So they're kind of on board from the beginning.
Correct. And I always joke around and I say, Kaiser, we've got a formulary for physicians by physicians, mm-hmm. right? Because we have our physicians upstream so far in advance before the drug gets approved to FDA, and we're looking across the therapeutic category as well. It may not even be, the same drug in the same group, but, we're looking at that therapeutic category holistically.
So for the providers that are not in the room as you're having this discussion, how does this information get to the physicians who are on the front line?
Great question, Kristen. As we all know, information is hard to disseminate, and within Kaiser, we have invested in another group of pharmacists. We call them drug education coordinators, and they work at each of our local facilities so that we can bring that information that we've done ahead of time, that we've reviewed with the specialists, and we try to bring it, and we bring it to our frontline prescribers. And so our DECs are placed in each of our local centers to provide that unbiased, objective data with our prescribers, and they're, sometimes they're shoulder to shoulder with our prescribers at the same time. And what this does is it helps us to eliminate the need for sales rep within the Kaiser organization. And in fact, we actually limit sales reps on our campus because of our drug education coordinators. We call them DECs because of our DECs who are able to provide this unbiased, objective data.
Okay, so they kind of take the place of a sales rep on our campuses.
Yeah.
Okay, helpful. So Adrian, this sounds like a fairly unique process. As Jerry mentioned, there's KP, there's the VA, there's a handful of others that do have practices like this. But for those who don't, can you tell us a little bit more about sales reps and how that works in other systems? Without an internal education process available in every system, is there a place for sales reps in the healthcare system?
If you're trying to promote rational prescribing among your prescribers, bar the door to sales reps. They are very highly trained. They're very highly trained professionals. They're trained in psychologic techniques, and they're very manipulative. And they don't even have objective information about drugs to give. They are given information on a need-to-know basis. They may be given some information on how to combat some beliefs that physicians and other prescribers have that maybe don't support their drugs. But academic detailing and internal drug information systems are great. Prescribers need objective drug information, but you also need to prevent them from having access to people who are going to undermine evidence-based understanding of therapeutics.
So with sales reps, it sounds a little bit more like you're obviously promoting a particular drug and don't have a ton of information about other drugs that might be in that class that might also work for that disease. And in academic detailing, it might sound a little bit more like, this is the disease, this is something that we're trying to treat, what's the best course of treatment? And then you might have a little bit more of a holistic approach. Does that seem fair?
Sure, and yeah, and even about their own drug, drug reps are never going to be, and companies are never going to be accurate purveyors of information about their drug. In fact, drug reps are taught how to deal with perceptions of adverse effects. So if a drug causes nausea, for example, the drug rep might say, well, some of your patients need to lose some weight anyway. If your drug causes heavy sedation, well, it helps them sleep. And if your drug causes liver failure, that's harder to spin.
That's hard. Okay, I'm gonna bring it to Kim for one more question. I think we have time for one more question, then we'll do some audience Q&A. So you painted this picture about how the formularies are developed internally, how our clinicians consistently prescribe according to that formulary. I want to talk a little bit about biosimilars in particular. So there's a bill in Congress right now that's going to try and make it reintroduced, I think, for the third time to try and make it easier to prescribe biosimilar drugs. Can you talk a little bit about why prescribing biosimilars is important and how we do it at KP?
Yeah, so let me start with, as I was thinking about our Kaiser biosimilar experience, I had to reflect on how long we've been working with biosimilars or how long we have had biosimilars within our organization. Do you know what that is? A decade. Kaiser Permanente has been working with biosimilars for nearly a decade. And so, and I like to say that our biosimilar story and our biosimilar success is actually built on the way biosimilars were released. First one was GCSF for supportive care, and then we moved on to Inflectra for IBD, and then we built on the oncology biosimilars. And every time we introduced a biosimilar into organization, not only do we do it from an evidence-based manner as we spoke before, but we also feel like it's our responsibility as biosimilar leaders within KP to actually go back and review the outcomes associated with using those biosimilars. And so we've published quite a bit of information out there about, patient perception on using biosimilars, on the non-inferiority of using biosimilars. We've now also embarked on biosimilar conversions within our organization. And so we feel it's our responsibility not as just, to use biosimilars effectively within our organization, but also we have a responsibility back to the market to show that they are safe and effective. Mm-hmm. So when we think about some of the barriers to biosimilar adoption, I think about the mistrust that folks have already shared from pharmaceutical companies about, maybe biosimilars not being effective, or maybe it causing these side effects, or all of this misinformation that's been shared. And so one of those barriers is ensuring that our prescribers have trust in the use of biosimilars. I think it's great that this bill is going to be introduced that will eliminate the interchangeability that added another level of mistrust, or some complexity, or making biosimilars more complex than they actually are. And and I think it's our responsibility also is to share that real data and outcomes of how successful you can be with using biosimilars and what that means to your health plan, your health system. I mean, costs go down. We've been able to share those reductions in cost with our members by decreasing their copay. So there's this responsible way of using it within an organization, and I think Kaiser's done a great job in showing that.
And hopefully we can be continuing to lead the way in this country, because as we know, the adoption has been a lot slower in the U.S. than it has been in other countries. And our next panel after lunch can talk about the real-world implications of some of the policies on the table, including whether this bill has a chance of passing this time around. So we'll not pontificate on that and wait for the experts to talk about what we think is possible in the future. I'm going to pivot to audience Q&A. I know we're a few minutes behind, so we're cutting into lunch, but I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity for anyone in the room who wants to ask a question to either Adrienne or to Kim.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for this informative discussion. My name is Tarana. I'm a pharmacist, currently PhD student in health services research at UMB. My question is that a lot that we usually discuss is about labels, indication of medications. And off-label drug use is usually overlooked, which is an important topic currently with regard to GLP-1, ketamine, and then COVID-19 pandemic. What can we do to somewhat address the irrational prescribing in terms of off-label drug use?
Does anyone want to tackle that about off-label use and rational prescribing?
So a lot of irrational prescribing is off-label. Physicians don't generally know what's on-label and off-label, and to be fair, it's hard to tell because there are so many indications for drugs that it's for specific drugs that it's impossible to actually memorize all the indications. So, for example, Lipitor does one thing, right? Like atorvastatin, it lowers cholesterol, but it's got something like 17 indications with various sort of patient profiles in those indications. So it can be very difficult sometimes to tell what's off-label, what's on-label. But there's a lot of off-label promotion. Much of that is done through the use of key opinion leaders or influencers who are hired by drug companies. Because of course it's illegal for them to do off-label promotion, but it's not illegal for some, academic from an institution to say that a migraine drug is good for bipolar disorder or whatever it is. So there's a lot of off-label promotion that goes on, but there's a higher rate of irrational prescribing in the off-label area than in the on-label area. But there's a lot of irrational prescribing on-label as well.
Any other questions? I've got one more question, and then we can close out and let people go have lunch. But I did promise that I would come back to this about direct-to-consumer prescribing, not just direct-to-consumer advertising. So we're seeing this on the rise, especially for newer classes of drugs like GLP-1s, and then also for a couple others as well. From your perspective, has this trend affected patient demand? I would love to ask both of you this question. Has it affected patient demand? Has it affected prescribing practices? Has it affected the broader healthcare system?
Yes, definitely. And I see it as there being sort of real telehealth and fake telehealth. And Kaiser has actually been a pioneer in using telehealth in a way that is really helpful to patients. You can bring specialists into remote areas. You can do follow-up visits without patients having to come in. But that's still in the context of patients having primary care and having a dedicated prescriber. There has been this plethora lately of these essentially fake telehealth companies or telehealth companies that are working very closely with pharmaceutical companies to essentially sell prescription drugs directly to consumers. And with some of these sites, the consumer can put a drug into their cart before they have a supposed interaction with a prescriber to prescribe that drug. Mm-hmm. That interaction often isn't face-to-face. It is, it might be just through a text or email message. You answer a few questions, and then you get to check out with your prescription drug. I think this is really threatening to patient care. This isn't patient care at all. This is patients deciding that a specific drug is good for them and buying it off the internet with some cooperative prescriber writing prescriptions for anybody who asks.
Yeah. I mean, I can agree with you more, Adrienne. I mean, what we're seeing today now, and I actually was thinking about what we said earlier, what someone said earlier, I think that was your question, when said, pharmaceutical companies find prescribers in the way of their customers, right? Mm-hmm. And so they found ways to work around that, or they found other creative ways to address it. And so what we're seeing now is manufacturers partnering with these telehealth community physician groups to say, hey, well, if your physician won't prescribe you a GLP, we can help you find a provider that will help you with your weight loss journey. And, so that becomes an open door to now what we're seeing is more complex specialty disease states where they're working with it, like dementia or whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where it gets a little, challenging and difficult is appropriate care. Do you lose appropriate care when you're going straight to the manufacturer who's going to refer you to a partner telehealth provider to get you that medication? And so, I mean, there's a lot of creative ways that this direct-to-consumer prescribing is playing out in our marketplace now. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much to our fireside chat panel for filling up the hour anyway. Thank you. It is now time for lunch. We are going to aim to be back in our seats still at 12:45. Lunch is buffet style in the back. So we will see you in about 35 minutes. Thanks.